Good morning, church. Welcome to this edition of Checking In with Pastor Jim. It's Monday. I've missed you. I didn't see you yesterday. I kind of saw you the day before. We didn't check in with Pastor Jim so much as hang out with Pastor Jim. But today is an official check-in, as it should be, on Monday, July the 20th, 2020. Going to be a hot day out there today, as it has been for the last several. But be thankful for air conditioning if you have it. Maybe you can hear mine running in the background. I'm glad I have it, believe you me. So what am I thinking about this morning? I'll tell you. I'm thinking about equality. Equality. And it started by thinking about the Declaration of Independence. Remember July the 4th? Wasn't that long ago? The full text of the Declaration of Independence was printed in the Richmond Times-Dispatch, and I took the time to read it. I love the way it begins, right? Something about we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Isn't that in the Declaration of Independence? We hold these truths to be self-evident. Self-evident. You don't even have to do your homework. You can just see for yourself. All men are created equal. Maybe you've seen this musical, Hamilton. I got to see it at the theater with my wife, Christy. It was an anniversary gift to her. But I also got to see it recently on the screen. Disney Plus had made it available, the Broadway edition of Hamilton. There's a place in there where one of the Schuyler sisters is talking about Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. It says that all men are created equal, and she says, I hope that he'll include women in the sequel. You remember that line? Hope that he'll include women in the sequel. Aren't all women created equal with all men? Wouldn't you want to say that all people are created equal? Well, of course, that's what Thomas Jefferson meant, right? Back in those days, people just used the word man to mean mankind or humankind. So surely, when Thomas Jefferson wrote, all men are created equal, he meant men and women, right? And white men and black men, right? And Native American men and women, right? I really don't think he did. When I read on through the Declaration of Independence, there is a place where Jefferson, or whoever was drafting that Declaration of Independence, says about Native Americans, that they are savages. And it doesn't sound as if he is considering them equal to the white men of European descent who framed the Constitution and who drafted the Declaration. I think when Thomas Jefferson said all men are created equal, he really meant all men like me. All of us who have European ancestry and who have gotten an education and who can come up with the big words necessary to write a declaration, all of us are equal, but not everybody, right? So, I think it was Abraham Lincoln who referred to that same concept in the Gettysburg Address, which was delivered in November of 1863. He said, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. I'm wondering if Lincoln delivered that line with a little different nuance than Thomas Jefferson intended. Was Lincoln trying to say that black men as well as white men were created equal? And that's part of the reason we are fighting this great civil war. I don't know. Some of you historians can correct me on that. I do know this, that women did not get the right to vote until 1920. The 19th Amendment was passed by Congress in 1919, but it wasn't ratified until 1920. Now, think about this for a minute. Women, in 1776, The Declaration of Independence said that all men are created equal. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln said this nation was founded on the principle that all men are created equal. It wasn't until 1920 that women got the right to vote. Why was that? That's kind of what I'm wondering this morning. And I confess to you again and again, I am not a student of history, but maybe I am becoming one because I'm curious about these things. I want to know. Why did it take women so long to get the vote? Well, it could be this. The argument could be made that women were not as well educated as men in those days, right? And the same argument could be made for why Black Americans were denied the vote for so long. We could talk about that if you have time for it, how in the South it was still taking Black Americans a long time to have that freedom to vote. Maybe you could say, well, they aren't as well educated, and you have to be educated to vote. The best decisions are informed decisions, and the more information you have, the better choices you can make. I agree with all of that. But I also believe in the full equality of all human beings, by which I mean we are all made in the image of God. That is a theological proposition. It's not political, it's not humanitarian, it's theological. All human beings are made in the image of God, and in that sense we are all equal in God's eyes. When God looks at us, there isn't a one that he loves more or less because of skin color or gender. I think God just loves all God's children. So, when I think about equality, one of the things I think about is equality among men and women. And in my marriage, I am striving for full equality. I asked Christy the question this morning. I said, do you believe that we have a marriage of full equality? And she said yes. But I will also tell you, it might not have been that way. I grew up in a family that was very religious, fairly conservative in some respects. My mother began to wear a head covering as a sign of submission to her husband. This was after she began attending a Pentecostal church where the women wore head coverings as a sign of submission. My mother began doing that. And when people would ask her, what's that head covering for? She would say, it's a sign of submission to my husband. Well, I grew up with a lot of that. And I remember my first serious girlfriend and I were talking about who would make the rules in our marriage. And I said, well, we can talk about these things, but if it ever comes down to a decision that just has to be made, of course, I will be the one to make it because I am the man. She didn't see it that way. And we had long conversations about that, as you might imagine. Well, by the time I met and married Christy, I think I had given up that notion. And part of it is because of what's in the Bible. I learned this mostly later when I was in seminary, but looking back at a passage like Ephesians 5:21, it says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And then in the next verse, Ephesians 5:22, it says, wives, submit like this. And then a little later in that passage, it says, and husbands, like this. But Ephesians 5:21, it says, submit to one another, husbands and wives, out of reverence for Christ. It calls for mutual submission, as if men and women could be equals in marriage. I believe that they can. And I've been striving for a marriage of absolute equality. Because I know that Christy is made in God's image, and I'm made in God's image. And just because I'm a man and she's a woman doesn't mean that I should get to make all the rules in our marriage. I think when you cast that net a little wider and begin to talk about who gets to make rules in society, if we really are all made in the image of God, it shouldn't come down to just white men, should it? But have you seen a picture of the founding fathers in this country? Just want you to look. I would almost fit right in. I'm a little swarthy for this bunch, but here's a picture of founding fathers after doing a Google image search, and they do look like white men of European ancestry. And I always say, before you join any organization, take a look at who gets to make the rules. If it's mostly old white men, then the rules will tend to favor old white men. If it's mostly young black women, then the rules will tend to favor young black women. So in a marriage, who gets to make the rules? I'm going with Ephesians 5:21. Husbands and wives, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Reverence for Christ. So when Christy and I make decisions these days, we do it like this. We talk about it until we reach agreement. If we can't reach agreement, we say, well, we'll have to let that one sit for a while. But there is no point at which I overpower her because I'm a man. No point at which she overpowers me because she's a woman. We talk about these things. We reach an agreement. We go forward together. Most of the time it works like this. Last night, for example, I said, what if you make an omelet while I go down to the gelato shop and get us a pint of gelato? And she said, that sounds good. And that's what we did. She whipped up an omelet. I made the long trek down the street, about a half a block, to the gelato shop, bought some salted caramel gelato, and brought it home. And we had the most lovely dinner, topped off by dessert, you could ask for. That's a marriage of full equality right there. Next time, I'll make the omelet, and she can get the gelato. Hey, thanks for listening. You can tell I've got a lot on my mind today. I am thinking about equality, not only in marriage, but in this country. And how is it that we can work toward more equality for every person made in God's image? I'm thinking about that today. Hope you're thinking good thoughts, and hope you've been inspired by this morning's check-in with Pastor Jim. I will see you again tomorrow.